The shed rising behind Rosa Marek's wheat field looked ordinary from the road. That was the strange part. From the outside, it was just another High Plains outbuilding in 1911. Rough cottonwood posts, plank siding, a pitched roof, and a wagon-wide door. But anyone who stepped inside saw the mistake. Under that plain wooden shell, Rosa was building a second building. Not square, not straight, not even made of boards. It was a red clay tunnel. A low barrel vault made from curved drainage tile, fire brick, lime mortar, and stubbornness. Piece by piece, she set the tile into an arch until it looked less like a barn, and more like the inside of a giant bread oven. Between the wooden shed and the clay vault, she left a narrow, hidden space, 14 inches wide. Then she packed that space with chopped straw, sifted coal ash, and loose chaff from the threshing floor. To the men at the Smith County grain office, it was the most expensive way imaginable to make a building worse. Warren Pike, the grain buyer who kept the town's ledgers and decided whose wheat was worth shipping, called it a kiln for cows. He had watched the wagon loads of tile arrive from the rail siding. He knew what they cost. He knew Rosa had sold her 2 best mule colts to pay for them. And he believed he knew exactly what would happen. The first real cold snap would turn the clay into a sweating wall. Moisture would bead on the inside. The straw would go sour. The animals would cough. Any feed stored inside would mold black before January. Rosa listened to him without raising her voice. She pressed another tile into the arch and said, "A kiln only sweats when the draft is wrong." Pike laughed about that line for 3 weeks. Then the blizzard came. And when he finally opened Rosa Marek's barn door, after 6 days of weather that froze fence wire solid, he did not find mold. He did not find dead stock. He did not find a foolish immigrant woman standing inside her own failure. He found 2 draft horses sweating in the middle of winter. And in that moment, the smartest man in the grain office realized he had misunderstood the building from the start. Rosa had not built a brick barn. She had built a way to make the wind lose its teeth. This is the story of a woman who carried kiln knowledge onto the prairie, hid the answer inside a wall, and proved that the difference between ruin and survival can be only 14 inches of dead air. Rosa Marek was not raised for wheat. She had come to Kansas from Moravia with a work apron, a cracked wedding photograph, and a set of hands that knew heat better than soil. Before America, before the endless fields, before the railroad towns, and the weather that seemed to arrive with a temper, she had worked beside her father in a tile yard outside Brno. Her father did not own the yard. He was a kiln setter, which meant he understood the invisible part of fire. Other men saw flames. Her father saw movement. He knew where hot air would rise too fast, where a cold corner would steal heat, where smoke would pool, where a firing would crack 1,000 roof tiles because one careless mason had made a wall too flat or a throat too narrow. Rosa grew up carrying damp clay, stacking green tile, and listening to men argue about drafts. By 17, she could tell from the sound of a firing whether the kiln was pulling cleanly. By 20, she could pack a barrel vault so it held heat long after the fire had dropped to embers. The lesson was never simply that brick was strong. The lesson was that air was lazy. Air would move only where the shape told it to move. Give it a straight crack, and it would race through. Give it a cold surface, and it would dump its moisture. Give it a pocket too small to circulate, and it would sit there, harmless, like a trapped animal. That knowledge had no obvious value on the Kansas plains. At least, not at first. Rosa and her husband, Anton, took a small claim north of the Republican River in the spring of 1910. Their first shelter was a box cabin patched together from cottonwood boards, sod blocks, tar paper, and hope. In fair weather, it almost looked like a house. In winter, it behaved like a sieve. The wind did not knock on that cabin. It entered. It slipped under the sill boards, whistled through nail holes, lifted the tar paper in little black flaps, and drove dust through the wall seams until the family's blankets smelled of earth. When the north wind blew hard enough, the flame in Rosa's oil lamp bent sideways and stayed there, burning as if the whole room had become the inside of a chimney. Anton tried every fix his neighbors recommended. He banked the walls with sod. He stuffed rags into the cracks. He nailed feed sacks over the window. He hung the horse blanket behind the door. He burned more wood. None of it solved the real problem. The cabin was not losing heat only because its walls were thin. It was losing heat because the wind was organizing the air inside the room. Cold air shoved in low. Warm air fled upward. The stove fought all night, glowing red, while the floor stayed cold enough to numb bare feet. Rosa watched the pattern with a kiln setter's eye. She saw the draft. She saw the loop. She saw the Prairie using their cabin like a badly built flue. One night in February, the wind rose so sharply that the door latch frosted white on the inside. Rosa woke to the sound of Anton splitting apart the last crate boards for fuel. Their youngest child was coughing under 2 quilts. The water bucket had a skin of ice on it, though it sat only 8 feet from the stove. That was the night Rosa stopped thinking like a farmer's wife and started thinking like her father's daughter. A square room, she realized, gave the wind everything it wanted. Flat walls caught pressure. Corners trapped cold. Joints opened under strain. Heat gathered uselessly near the roof, far above the people and animals who needed it. But a kiln did the opposite. A kiln curved the heat back down. A kiln used thick material to steady temperature. A kiln kept the living draft under control. And a kiln never depended on one wall to do every job. By morning, Rosa had drawn the first version of the barn on a flour sack. Anton stared at the sketch for a long time. It showed a normal wooden shed on the outside. But inside it, like a secret heart, was a low clay arch. Between the two was a packed cavity. The animals would live inside the arch. A small stove would sit near one end. Feed would be stored above the wooden rafters, away from the damp ground. Anton said, "It looks like an oven." Rosa answered, "Only if we build it stupid." The plan should have ended there. They did not have the money. Then summer burned the pasture brown. Wheat prices fell. Anton injured his shoulder under a wagon tongue and could not swing an axe for more than a few minutes at a time. The practical answer was to build the same kind of shed everyone else built. Posts, planks, a roof, and a prayer. Rosa refused. In September, she sold 2 mule colts she had raised from spring. They were good animals, clean-legged and steady, the sort of team a small farm could build itself around. Warren Pike bought them through a cousin, and told everyone at the grain office that the Marek woman had traded future power for fancy brick. Then she ordered curved tile, damaged fire brick, lime, and a load of coal ash from the rail siding. The first phase made sense to the neighbors. The wooden shell went up quickly. Men riding past nodded at the frame. It was plain, useful, and exactly the kind of structure the plains understood. Then the tile arrived. The laughter arrived with it. Rosa laid the first course on a shallow stone footing. Each tile was heavier than it looked. Rough red clay with soot-dark edges from a previous firing. She worked with a mason's line, a plumb bob, and 2 curved wooden forms Anton had cut before his shoulder gave out. The work was slow. Set tile, butter edge, tap level, scrape mortar, brace, repeat. By the 3rd day, the arch had risen high enough to show its shape. By the 7th, It looked unmistakably wrong against the straight barn frame around it. A tunnel inside a shed. A fired clay lung under a wooden rib cage. Children came to watch. Men came to joke. Women came more quietly, looking at the curve with the tired interest of people who had spent too many winters cold. Warren Pike came last. He stepped inside in a clean wool coat and stood with his hands behind his back, the way a man stands when he has already decided the verdict. "Mrs. Marek," he said, "you know warm animals breathe wet air." Rosa kept working. Pike tapped the clay wall with his walking stick. "That moisture will touch this brick and turn to water. Then it will run down into your straw. Then your straw will rot. Then the rot will freeze. Then you will have spent 2 colts building a sickness box." His logic was not foolish. In an ordinary building, it would have been right. Warm breath on a cold wall does make water. Damp straw does rot. Frozen moisture does destroy insulation. Pike understood storage, spoilage, and winter loss better than most men in the county. He simply could not see the one part of the structure that mattered most, because Rosa had hidden it inside the wall. She had not built a cold brick surface. She had built an inner skin that the outside cold could barely reach. The 14-inch cavity behind the arch was packed so tightly with straw, chaff, and ash that air could not circulate through it. It was not a hollow gap. It was not a chimney. It was a dead air jacket. The outside wooden wall would take the first blow of the wind. The packed cavity would stop the wind from turning into a moving current. The clay vault would remain close to the temperature of the inside air, not the outside storm. No cold surface meant no indoor rain. No moving air in the wall meant no heat thief. No square ceiling meant no useless pool of warmth overhead. Rosa understood all of that. But she had learned long ago that explaining draft to a man who had never listened to a kiln was like explaining color to a ledger. So she only said, "The straw will stay dry." Pike smiled the tired smile of a man hearing nonsense. "I hope you are right," he said. He did not mean it. By the end of November, the vault was complete. The doorway at the east end was framed low and tight. A small iron stove stood near the family corner. The cow stalls ran along one side. A workbench and feed bins lined the other. The clay ceiling arched overhead, rough and red and strangely gentle in the lamplight. From outside, it looked like an ordinary shed. Inside, it felt like standing in a held breath. The blizzard arrived on December 18th. The morning began with a sky the color of dirty tin. By noon, the wind came hard from the northwest. By dusk, the snow stopped falling downward and began traveling sideways in white ropes across the fields. At midnight, the temperature dropped below 0. By the second day, it was 28 below, with gusts so strong they packed snow through cracks in barn siding and drove loose straw across the ground like needles. The storm erased distance. Fence posts vanished. The road disappeared. The rail line became a white scar under drifting snow. Men who knew the country their whole lives would not walk 50 yards without tying rope from door to door. In the ordinary cabins, winter became a siege. At the Novak place, frost formed on the inside of the north wall in feathers thick enough to scrape with a spoon. Their stove burned through split wood so fast the oldest boy started feeding it broken crates. 5 feet away, his little sister cried because her boots had frozen stiff beside the bed. At the Keller farm, the cattle crowded under a lean-to and turned white with blown snow. The family tried to bring the weakest calf inside, but the cabin was already so full of smoke and cold drafts that the animal shivered until morning anyway. At Warren Pike's grain office, sacks near the outer wall crusted with frost. The little coal stove smoked whenever the wind changed direction. Pike stayed there through the second night, guarding records and praying the elevator roof would hold. Inside Rosa Marek's brick vault, the storm sounded far away. Not absent. Never that. The wind still roared around the wooden shell. Snow still beat against the door. The outer boards still creaked under pressure, but the air inside the clay arch did not move. That was the miracle before anyone knew to call it engineering. The stove did not need to be fed constantly. The cow's breath rose in slow pale clouds and vanished, instead of freezing on the wall. Damp mittens hung from pegs and dried by morning. Rosa's youngest slept without coughing for the first night in weeks. Most telling of all was the milk. Every evening, Rosa set the pail on a shelf near the feed bins, not beside the stove, not hidden under a blanket, just sitting in the room like an ordinary thing. Every morning, the milk poured. In half the county, milk had to be chopped from a pail with a knife during weather like that. In Rosa's barn, it poured. On the fourth day, someone began pounding on the outer door. Anton reached for the shotgun before Rosa stopped him. The pounding came again, weak but desperate, almost swallowed by the wind. They opened the door just wide enough for a man to fall through. It was Caleb Rusk, one of Pike's haulers. His beard was armored in ice. His eyelashes had frozen into white spikes. Behind him, barely visible in the blowing snow, stood two big Belgian horses, heads down, legs trembling, harness straps stiff with frost. He had been hauling coal to a farm west of the rail line when the storm blinded him. He missed the road, lost the ditch, and followed a fence until even the fence disappeared. The horses had carried him until they could not. "My team," he said. "They're done." Rosa looked past him at the animals. "Bring them in." Caleb stared at the low arched doorway. "They won't fit. They will duck." And they did. One at a time, the great horses lowered their heads and stepped into the clay vault. Snow fell from their manes in clumps. Their sides heaved. Rosa and Anton stripped the frozen harness away while Caleb sat near the stove with both hands around a cup he could not stop shaking. For the next 2 days, the horses stood in the center aisle of Rosa's impossible barn. They ate. They drank. Their ears lifted. Their legs steadied. The frost disappeared from their coats. Then, on the 6th morning, the wind finally stopped. The silence after a blizzard is almost violent. The world becomes too bright, too still, too clean. Snowdrifts stood against buildings like waves frozen at the moment of breaking. Doors had to be dug open. Chimneys poked from white mounds like fence stakes. Warren Pike came looking for Caleb with 3 men and a coil of rope. He expected death, or something close to it. A missing hauler in a 6-day blizzard did not usually become a cheerful story. 2 valuable Belgian horses missing with him made the search urgent. Pike followed the drifted line of the road until he saw the top of Rosa's shed roof above the snow. He climbed down from his horse, stiff and grim, and pushed through the drift to the barn door. When he slid it open, the first thing that touched his face was not warmth. It was stillness. That unnerved him more. He had opened enough winter barns to expect the knife of cold air, the smell of frost, the sharp bite that made a man's eyes water. Instead, he felt mild animal air. Damp, yes. Earthy, yes. But not freezing. Not moving. Not dead. Then he saw Caleb sitting on an overturned bucket, eating bread. He saw Rosa's children carrying feed. He saw the cow alive. And then he saw his horses. The Belgians stood under the red clay arch with their heads low and their coats darkened at the neck and shoulders. At first Pike thought they were wet from melted snow. Then one horse shook its mane, and a faint steam lifted off its back. They were sweating, not drenched, not overheated, just warm enough, alive enough, restored enough that their bodies had begun to throw off heat instead of surrendering it. Pike stepped inside without speaking. He touched the clay wall. Dry. He pulled a handful of straw from a small inspection gap Rosa had left near the door. Dry. He looked up at the curved ceiling. No beads of condensation. No icy feathers. No drip marks. No black mold. Only red clay, faint stove warmth, animal breath, and a silence he did not understand. Rosa watched him run his hand over the wall. Finally Pike said, "Why is it dry?" That was the first honest question he had asked. So Rosa answered it. She showed him the outer shed wall, battered by the storm but still standing. She showed him the packed cavity, where straw and ash stopped the air from moving. She tapped the clay arch and explained that it was not cold enough to collect water because the dead air jacket held the outside away from it. She did not use the language of engineers. She used the language of kilns. "The storm pulls," she said. "This does not let it pull through." Pike was a ledger man. That was his flaw, but it was also his strength. Saw the result. He did not argue with it. He asked how much tile she had used. He asked how thick the cavity was. He asked whether the ash mattered. He asked where condensation would have formed if the cavity had been left hollow. He asked the questions of a man whose mind was changing in real time. A week later, he placed an order at the rail siding, not for wheat sacks, not for coal, for discounted curved drainage tile and firebrick seconds. The rail clerk asked him what a grain buyer wanted with kiln tile. Pike said, "I'm tired of paying freight on frozen air." Within a year, 3 small storage sheds near the Smith County elevator had been retrofitted with inner clay vaults and packed wall cavities. They were not beautiful. They were not identical to Rosa's barn. Some were clumsy. One cracked at the crown and had to be braced. But the principle spread because it saved fuel, protected feed, and kept winter from turning buildings into machines for stealing heat. Rosa did not become famous. No patent was filed. No newspaper called her a genius. No agricultural college sent a professor to sketch her barn. Her name did not enter the textbooks of building science. But the idea she carried was real. Modern builders would later use terms like thermal envelope, air infiltration, convective heat loss, dew point control, radiant mass, and double wall assembly. Rosa had none of those words. She had a kiln setter's memory and a winter problem no amount of extra planking could solve. She understood that cold is not always the enemy you fight first. Sometimes the enemy is movement. Air moving through cracks. Heat moving to a surface that should never have been allowed to get cold. Moisture moving to the wrong side of a wall. Wind turning a home into a chimney. Everyone else tried to build a thicker box. Rosa built a quieter one. And that was the lesson Warren Pike saw in those sweating horses. The barn did not win because brick was magical. It won because Rosa gave every layer a single job. The outer shell took the weather. The packed cavity stopped the draft. The clay vault held and returned the heat. The curve refused to let warmth die in corners. It was not brute force. It was order. The prairie punished shapes that pretended the wind was simple. Rosa had spent her life around fire, and fire had taught her that invisible forces still obey rules. Wind obeyed rules. Heat obeyed rules. Moisture obeyed rules. Survival belonged to the person humble enough to learn those rules before winter arrived. From the road, Rosa Marek's barn never looked like much. Just a wooden shed half buried in snow. But inside, under that plain roof, was a red clay arch that turned a blizzard into a muffled sound beyond the wall. A kiln shape made for fire had learned how to hold back winter. In the morning Warren Pike found his horses alive, steaming softly in the still air. The whole county learned the same thing Rosa had known from the beginning. The answer was not to fight the wind harder. The answer was to stop feeding it. Thank you for watching this story of forgotten ingenuity. If you value these histories of practical intelligence, subscribe for more stories where old knowledge solves problems modern certainty almost missed. This video is a historically inspired reconstruction for educational storytelling. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized, while the building principles discussed are based on real concepts in heat transfer, air movement, insulation, and traditional construction. This content is not professional engineering, construction, legal, or safety advice. Any real-world building work should follow current codes and qualified professional guidance.